Hi, students. Welcome back to our virtual classroom. You got to spend some time with Dr. Sowell yesterday. We're transitioning from covering that new material in units 8 and 9 to starting in on the actual review. So welcome from Marshfield, Wisconsin. I know that all of your teachers are missing you. I am missing my students as well. But Dr. Sowell and I are so glad that you're spending some time being our virtual students. And so we're going to take just a minute and look at this slide that you've seen a couple times already and are probably going to see a couple of more times to remind you the date of your national exam, Monday, May 18th, and that you're going to write 2 FRQ questions. One of them is focused on designing an investigation, the other on proposing a solution. And remember, the first 2 bulleted points here are the same. And then today we're going to spend a little bit more time kind of in the design and investigation part of it, at least for the homework that you do. So let's take a minute to warm up. Yesterday with Dr. Sowell, we introduced or got started in the review in Unit 1, and I'm going to cover kind of the targets in the middle section of Unit 1 today. I think that as we go through this information, you're going to see that it was really helpful to go back and spend some time learning that content in important units 8 and 9 so we can make some connections. The model that Dr. Sowell introduced yesterday, where he reviewed some content, we did a little bit of practice together, and then he left you with a part of an FRQ prompt that you could write on your own so that you really get time to practice that. That's the model that will carry through for all of the additional review lessons. There are 18 of them altogether. So let's take a look at the homework that you did. You can grab that, the assignment that you wrote yesterday. You spent some time yesterday looking at ecosystems, and you looked at that cool Arctic food web, and the prompts that you did for homework were having to do with why animals migrate. That's kind of a new learning target for us in our somewhat adjusted curriculum this year. So in taking a look at letter E, many species, including whales and birds, will travel thousands of kilometers during annual migrations. Provide one reason for that a species may migrate a long distance. So you can check your answer and see if you would have earned the 1 point for this. I think most of my students probably went with this first bulleted point, that animals migrate for their source of food or a source of water. The next bullet, maybe the food that they eat migrates. So a whale might follow a school of fish that is migrating. I think probably the next most used answer had something to do with migrating for availability of breeding grounds or nesting grounds, or areas to more protection from predators to rear their young. So hopefully you earned that point. Let's take a look at a sample student response to give you a little practice on if you can pick out if an answer does correctly qualify for earning a point. So take just a couple of seconds and read that response and see if you would point it or not. And obviously this student earned that 1 point. They talked about seasonal temperature changes, and that would coincide with this third bullet, more hospitable climate during certain seasons. And just remember that whenever you see that, provide a reason, a nice prompt, a nice term to get you prompted to move in that direction is simply to say, well, they do this because I'm providing a reason for that. Letters I and I that you answered. To describe one commercial fishing activity other than whaling that results in the death of right whales. And then that was worth 1 point. And then the next one, describe a strategy that would be a solution to that problem or could mitigate that problem. I will point out that it's really important that you read all of the prompt. Notice in the first part of that prompt, and I always tell my students before starting to write any part of their FRQ, read the entire thing all the way through first, and just take a minute to sit back and process kind of where that question's going. Notice that if I had read I before I read they kind of gave me a lot of information here. They tell me that whales migrate between subtropical and polar regions annually. So right there, I kind of got, oh, they're moving to a different climate. So the one thing I want to point out as you start to grade this is that they are 1 point for each answer, and that the strategy, the activities and strategy are linked. In other words, if I did not provide a correct commercial activity that threatens whales, I could not earn a point for a strategy. So that's not super common that points are linked, but it may occur on one of the questions that you see. So I think the most used response, a commercial activity that threatens whales, is that they get caught in, they end up as bycatch. They get caught in fishing nets or fishing gear from other fishing activities. Oftentimes the ships, large commercial transport vessels, are the channels that those ships use are the same as the migration lane for the whales. So that could be a commercial activity. And then some form of noise pollution that can disrupt a whale's navigation system. As we look at a solution or a strategy to mitigate that, what I want to point out is you want to avoid saying, oh, well, just don't let fishermen fish anymore and there won't be any bycatch if we don't let them put nets out there. Rarely can we have a justifiable, reasonable solution simply banning or eliminating a process. So if you're a little bit unsure, always think if you can express a way that you can reduce the impact of something, or limiting it, or providing an alternative. And notice that that idea comes up in a lot of our descriptions of strategies. Changing a type of fishing method. When I fish, the time of year that I fish, maybe I don't get to be in that fishing area where whales are when whales are migrating. A reduction in seismic survey activity, again, maybe even particularly when whales are migrating. Installing quieter motors. And then we certainly have this general idea that I can often regulate. A solution is to find people who don't pick up their nets from the ocean and leave them to threaten fish populations. So hopefully you got at least one of those points, maybe both of them. Just take, I'm going to show you in the rest of that student's response. So remember what we're looking for here. Describe a commercial activity that results in the death of whales and a strategy to reduce that. So let's take a look at this student response and see if you would have given that 0, 1, or 2 points. And actually the student earned 0 points for this. They did not earn the point for the activity that threatens the whale population because fishing of other fish does not directly cause the death of right whales. And if they didn't earn that first point, they couldn't earn the point for a solution or a strategy to decrease the effect of that. A note on misconceptions that came up when the readers were looking at this exam last year during the grading is that there seemed to be kind of a misconception about why animals migrate. And many students wrote in such a way that they indicated that they felt that animals migrated because of some type of human interaction with the environment, or some type of abrupt change in the environment that just randomly all of a sudden cause that animal to migrate, rather than understanding that that's an annual cycle. So we're going to go into the second part of Unit 1 today, and our big theme is biogeochemical cycles. We really spend all of our time today in this big idea of interaction between Earth systems, this little ERT abbreviation. The Earth is one interconnected system, and natural systems change over time and space. Biogeochemical systems vary in their ability to recover from disturbances. So we're going to demonstrate that we understand all of that big idea and can communicate that information by focusing on these two science practices. Visual representations, that both of our FRQs have that bulleted point in them. And obviously, if you remember your biogeochemical cycles, we're representing all of them with a model, with a visual model. And then, as I mentioned, we're really going to focus on scientific experimentation, primarily in your homework for tonight. So let's start off with our first kind of a general idea about biogeochemical cycles. They describe ways in which chemical elements move between biotic and abiotic components of an ecosystem. And so that's kind of like, how do chemical elements move between the living and the non-living portion? Like elements go from being in a rock to being in a plant or an animal. The chemical then, when we look at the model of that, it depicts the movement of atoms between sources and sinks for that biogeochemical cycle. They're called cycles because matter is conserved. And biogeochemical cycles facilitate the acquisition and transfer of energy into usable forms. Here's where we're really going to connect what you talked about yesterday with Dr. Sowell, where you looked at the energy transfer from one trophic level to another, and the second law of thermodynamics, that energy sort of peters out by the time I get to that top trophic level, because there's a diminishing of energy quality. But in biogeochemical cycles, we keep taking the same atoms and moving them from one place to another and reusing them over and over and over again. And obviously, we'll take a look at ways that humans have disrupted those cycles. That's what you should know by the end of our class period today. What you should be able to do is use those visual representations to describe a process, and then predict how if I have this system that's functioning the way it should, what happens when humans interfere with one part of that system? How does that throw the rest of that cycle out of balance? So let's start by looking at the phosphorus cycle. I have to keep remembering that this is all review for you, so you've seen this before. And remember, our model is going to be to go through some content and give you a chance to practice practice with the skill set at the end, and then you'll grade that tomorrow with Dr. Sowell. So I'm going to go through these steps rather quickly, and then we'll take a step back, kind of summarize the big idea. So we start out in the phosphorus cycle with rock weathering. This is some type of phosphorus containing rock, and that rock breaks down and releases that phosphorus into the soil. I am in the abiotic component of my ecosystem now. The next thing that happens is that plants can take up that phosphorus now that it's in the soil, and they assimilate it. They use that inorganic phosphorus from the non-living component of the environment, and they use it to build plant tissues. Think of like DNA is a biomolecule that has phosphorus in it. Well, then we have this little elk here, so that elk is munching on that plant, and whatever phosphorus compounds were in the plant, the animal has now gotten. See how we're combining that idea of food webs and energy transfer with biogeochemical cycles. That animal is then peeing and pooping, and in that process, that waste gets returned to the soil. And the minute that waste gets returned to the soil, a plant can take it up again. And so this part of the cycle is going pretty quickly, but we have this big issue that limits phosphorus in ecosystems. Some of that phosphorus is going to run off into the ocean and very slowly be incorporated into sedimentary rock, either sediment on the bottom of the ocean or on land. But the big takeaway that you should have from the phosphorus cycle is that it happens really slowly. The major reservoirs of phosphorus are rock and sediment that contain this element phosphorus. And so a lot of the processes that are moving that phosphorus around are happening very slowly. Weathering of rock, geologic uplifting. And the other really big concept, and this will make a lot more sense when we frame it and compare it to the other biogeochemical cycles, is that this is probably one of the big things you remember about phosphorus. There is no atmospheric component. And because phosphorus never exists as a gas in the atmosphere, it doesn't cycle very quickly. And this limits the limitations this imposes on the return of phosphorus from the ocean and the land make phosphorus naturally scarce in aquatic and terrestrial ecosystems. And that is one of the big reasons that we were so excited that you watched our Unit 8 and 9 videos, because this is where we make that connection to that lecture Dr. Sowell did on eutrophication. The humans disrupt the phosphorus cycle because it's such a limiting factor in biological systems, because of that slow breakdown of rock and sedimentary uplift, that we often have to add phosphorus containing fertilizer to an agricultural field to get a good productivity, a good yield. We even put so much phosphorus on our lawns just to cut them every week and not really harvest any food. Doesn't really make much sense. But a lot of that phosphorus is going to run off into an aquatic ecosystem. It's plant food, just like my plant got and assimilated that phosphorus into organic material. That's plant food for phytoplankton or algae. And when that algae decomposes, they cause a big drop in the amount of oxygen. We get these dead zones, like you can see in the Gulf of Mexico. This is some NASA MODIS satellite imagery that shows me the Gulf of Mexico in the summer and the winter, and the red and orange colors are indicating high concentrations of phytoplankton. The next cycle we're going to look at is the nitrogen cycle. This is one of my favorites. So the big ideas about the nitrogen cycle, let's kind of go through the nitty gritty and then we'll take a step back again. The major reservoir for nitrogen is the atmosphere. 78% of the atmosphere is nitrogen. It's this inorganic, abiotic molecule of nitrogen gas. And the first step in the nitrogen cycle that we need to know about is this step called nitrogen fixation, where I'm taking atoms of molecular nitrogen gas and converting them to ammonia. And by the way, if I'm going to write about or describe this process on an FRQ, I can always put the name of the chemical compound ammonia, or I can put the formula for the chemical compound NH3. And if you remember when you first studied the nitrogen cycle, this seems pretty straightforward when I look at it. But remember, it's not like the carbon cycle where plants have this amazing ability, because they have these chloroplasts, they have this ability to take inorganic carbon dioxide and convert it to a sugar. We'll look at that in a minute. It doesn't work that way with nitrogen. Plants can't just diffuse this nitrogen gas into their leaves and do that conversion. So if you remember, let's take a close-up look here. Oh, that's right. We have these special legumes that have these nodules in their root that have bacteria, and it's these amazing soil microbes that are actually doing this chemical conversion. So not all plants have the ability to take atmospheric nitrogen and convert it into ammonia. That ammonia then, just like that phosphorus, once it got into the soil into a usable form, then the plant took it up. Same thing happens with nitrogen. We've got this pattern emerging that once I get it into the soil, into a form that a plant can take up, same thing, that plant's going to take that ammonia and assimilate it into plant tissues, nitrogen containing plant tissues, like proteins, for example. So now I've got that assimilated into the plant, and then little bunny foo-foo here is eating that plant, and then the bunny poops, and that nitrogen goes into the soil, and soil microbes, those decomposers that in the food chain, break this organic biotic nitrogen down, back into an inorganic form so it can be taken up by a plant, to be eaten by an animal. So look at the idea here that there's rather rapid cycling for the most part of nitrogen. And we just keep this part of the cycle just keeps going and going and going. So now let's take that step back for a second. In terms of kind of the big takeaway, most of the reservoirs in which nitrogen compounds occur in the nitrogen cycle hold those compounds for a short period of time. Unlike the phosphorus cycle, most of the reservoirs like rocks and sediment hold that phosphorus for a long period of time. But in the nitrogen cycle, that bunny is eating and pooping a couple times a day. So they're holding that nitrogen for short periods of time. Just like phosphate or phosphorus can run off and cause eutrophication, nitrates or nitrogen can do the same thing. And then you may remember from Unit 7 on air pollution, is a kind of a tough concept on the formation of ground level or tropospheric ozone. We'll review it in Unit 7, but I'll mention it now so we can reconnect in a couple of weeks. When I burn gasoline in my car, the nitrogen impurities in that gasoline are emitted as NOx, that nitrogen oxide compound. That is a very harmful gas in and of itself and a precursor or component of photochemical smog. So let's take just a minute to kind of check in a little bit and see how we're doing on interpreting these diagrams so far. So this diagram depicts processes involved in the nitrogen cycle. Remember, even though and I kind of reframe this so it's not multiple choice, we're going to have to describe a lot of processes. So this is just really good little checks that we get the content and a little bit of skill practice. Which reservoir contains the majority of nitrogen? And you can't get that by looking at the diagram because I see reservoirs, but they're not quantified for me. So that's just something that I have to know, that the atmosphere of those reservoirs listed of all contains a lot of nitrogen. This is something that where we need to interpret the diagram directly. And this is something they could ask me in an FRQ prompt. They could present me with the diagram and ask me about a process. So what process is illustrated by the downward arrows from the atmosphere that show the conversion of nitrogen gas into usable forms available by the plant? So get up to these usable forms that are right available for plant. And they gave me a big clue here, what we just went over. Remember, that step is called nitrogen fixation. They're fixing the nitrogen. We're going to talk about fixing carbon here in a minute. I'm just fixing it or converting it to a form that can be taken up by plants, and plants then assimilate that or use it to build their body tissues. Here's another diagram. Which of the following statements is best supported by the diagram of the phosphorus cycle? I'll give you a minute to look at that one. And obviously the correct answer is that phosphates absorbed by animal tissue eventually, through consumption, eventually return to the soil. You intuitively should have known that based on our review we just did, but certainly the diagram depicts that. Notice there is no atmosphere shown, and that's something we probably remember about the phosphorus cycle. And plants cannot take the phosphorus up from the rock directly. That rock first has to break down or weather. That's why it's so slow. And phosphates are soluble in water because they show me them here in solution. One more, again, kind of more of a higher level application or interpretation of the processes shown in the cycle. We have the phosphorus cycle here again. Farmers in a suburban coastal town started using no-till agriculture. They're not tilling up the soil, a practice that reduces soil erosion from their farmland. Use the image to determine which of the following long-term effects no-till agriculture will have on the ecosystem surrounding the farmland. Reduces erosion. And the correct answer is there will be less algal growth in the nearby ocean. If I don't have erosion, I don't have an increased need for fertilizer. I probably have a decreased need because all that fertilizer is staying on my cropland where I put it. We don't ever have phosphorus in the atmosphere. And this just takes more time. Remember, I'm not going to see a direct impact of that. So let's just make sure we can talk through this process, because this is the kind of thing that we might have to do on an FRQ. If I decrease erosion, I decrease runoff. If I decrease runoff, I decrease that nutrient enrichment. I decrease the amount of phosphorus that entered my marine ecosystem, and there I decrease algal blooms. You guys are rocking. We're just sailing through this. Let's go to the carbon cycle. Oh, carbon cycle might be my favorite cycle now that I think of it. So we got a lot going on with the carbon cycle, and we're going to come back to the carbon cycle again and again and again and again as we talk about climate change throughout the rest of the review sessions. So the kind of big overarching idea they want us to come away with is that some of the reservoirs in which carbon compounds occur hold those compounds for a long period of time. That's kind of this geologic carbon cycle. Then we'll look at the second half of that statement. Some processes or reservoirs in the carbon cycle hold them for really short periods of time. So let's see what's going on here. This is our geologic carbon cycle. I'm representing just very simply the atmosphere, the ocean, and the lithosphere, the rocks, the solid part of our planet. And I start with getting that carbon dioxide into the atmosphere to begin with. And because this is a geologic representation of how carbon cycles, this is all the abiotic. I'm not, other than maybe, this isn't even living though, it's just the shell of an organism. So all I'm doing in this part is the inorganic part of the carbon cycle. I haven't gotten into any of the living things yet. So this is what happens on a planetary evolution scale. We got a trickle, slowly carbon dioxide came through the venting, through volcanism, and built up in our atmosphere, again, from a planetary evolutionary standpoint, as our atmosphere was forming just this right concentration of gases. So once that CO2 is in the atmosphere, it can go right into solution and dissolve in ocean water, or, and you remember this from the air pollution unit, it can form carbonic acid. It can form acid precipitation. So that carbon dioxide combines with water, that acidic or low pH precipitation can now weather rock. And the carbon can enter the ocean through that weathering of rock as well. Once I have this this carbon in my ocean water, remember when Dr. Sowell talked about coral ocean acidification and looked at the idea of how corals build their shells with that carbon? See how this is all coming together. It's so cool. They can actually take some of that and build carbonate or bicarbonate ions. Don't be concerned if you don't remember the chemical formulas for those. That's kind of a little bit higher level, even knowledge statement. As long as you, if you can get the idea that that dissolved carbon ultimately is going to be used by shelled organisms to build their shells. Some students on an FRQ, I think you may have looked at part of it yesterday, were very eloquent in their description of these chemical conversions, but I don't want you to get bogged down in all that detail. Carbon dioxide gets dissolved, and shelled organisms use it to build their shells. And then just like the phosphorus cycle, we can build that sediment up over time in sedimentary rock. And in the case of carbon, it's stored in fossil fuels in the lithosphere for long periods of time. And then maybe I have subduction. Maybe I have that lithospheric plate subducting, and I get that volcanic eruption, that island, the chain of volcanoes that occur along that subduction zone, and I can release that carbon dioxide back to the atmosphere. So all of this is happening on a very slow geologic time scale. Well, let's take a look at the processes that hold carbon in the carbon cycle for relatively short periods of time. And this is where we're really making the connection between what you did yesterday with energy transfer and what we're doing today with matter recycling. So in the process of photosynthesis, and many of you could write and balance this equation, all we really want you to take out of here is what's happening with the carbon. I'm going from an abiotic inorganic source of carbon, CO2 from the atmosphere, and this miraculous process of photosynthesis converts that into a sugar, a carbohydrate, a food that that plant uses. And then remember, just like in the nitrogen and phosphorus cycle, an animal is going to eat that plant and get the sugar, the carbohydrate from that. When the animal eats that plant, it has to break that plant body down. So little bunny Foo-Foo is eating that plant, and it digests the sugars that that plant made, and it converts the the sugar, the carbohydrate, back into carbon dioxide. And so remember that living things all need energy. So plants have to do that process of cellular respiration as well. You looked at that with the idea of gross and net primary productivity. So to reiterate, we have this rapid cycling of carbon where this plant is all day long when the sun is out. This big tree is photosynthesizing and making sugars, and then those bunnies are coming along and eating the leaves of that and breaking down that sugar and turning it into energy and giving off carbon dioxide back to the atmosphere as a byproduct. So I'm going to show you a quick NASA video, a really cool animation, mostly compiled from satellite imagery that shows me that rapid cycling of carbon. And then we'll take a second to describe what we're seeing in the video.
This is carbon dioxide, or CO2, in the Earth's atmosphere. It is derived from a synthesis of observed and simulated data. Reds and yellows show regions of higher than average CO2, while blues show regions lower than average. The pulsing of the data is caused by the day-night cycle of plant photosynthesis at the ground. As CO2 is lifted away from the surface, it is rapidly spread around the world by high-altitude winds. The high concentrations are from the buildup of CO2 during the Northern Hemisphere winter, when photosynthesis is not active. By July, photosynthesis in the vast vegetation regions north of the equator draws massive amounts of CO2 out of the atmosphere, resulting in low carbon dioxide across the entire Northern Hemisphere. The growth and decay of vegetation in northern lands cause the seasonal change in atmospheric carbon dioxide seen here between March and July. While seasonal changes in vegetation growth control CO2 on monthly timescales, human activities govern long-term carbon dioxide trends.
I'm sorry, I'm going to back this up just a little bit so we can see that image stopped here. So I want to make sure that you understand. Done a couple of these things before where we indicate a process by showing up and down or increase and decrease arrows. So I know that March isn't winter for some of you, but for those of us in northern latitudes, this is still winter. So a lot of times when students write about this rapid cycling of carbon, it's super easy for them to get this process kind of reversed. So in the Northern Hemisphere winter, where I have these massive amounts of land plants doing photosynthesis, in winter, they're greatly reduced photosynthesis. Less photosynthesis means higher concentrations of CO2 in the atmosphere because plants aren't removing it. And that's where I see these reds and yellows. And then in the Northern Hemisphere summer, in July, all of those plants are rapidly converting that carbon dioxide from an inorganic form to those sugars, and the carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere goes down. One thing you may have noticed is some kind of big plumes of carbon dioxide in the Southern Hemisphere, in South America and Africa. We often see that, and NASA is really tracking, especially because of increased fires due to climate change and fires that are set by humans for slash and burn agriculture. We see big plumes of carbon dioxide during fire season. Again, whether those fires are naturally set by humans for clearing land or forest fires that were sparked. So let's take a step back now and kind of put together that geologic and rapid cycling of carbon and make sense of these two big concepts that we want to make sure we understand. So this diagram is showing me pools and exchanges for different amounts of carbon. This GT, this is a gigaton, the unit, the amount of carbon stored there, and that's a billion metric tons of carbon. And so a couple things might surprise you. There is a lot of carbon stored in the ocean. Look at the amount of carbon in the deep ocean. This is an area that climate scientists are really looking at, is how much carbon is being stored in the deep ocean and how temperatures of the deep ocean are changing. Let's see if we can make sense of some of these arrows, because every lettered arrow here is depicting a process. So the first thing I notice is that arrows A and B seem to be complementary. And the amount of flux, or the amount of carbon moving from source to sink, isn't indicated there, but I will share with you that the amounts are rather, we're kind of in equilibrium. So you should be able to tell me the name of the process that takes carbon out of the atmosphere and moves it into vegetation. Photosynthesis. And then complementary to photosynthesis is cellular respiration, letter B. And those two quantities of fluxes are kind of in balance. The amount, if things are normal and humans haven't intervened too much, the amount of CO2 taken out by plants is kind of the same as the amount of CO2 put back in through cellular respiration of living things. Looks like we have some other kind of complementary arrows here. Remember, we said that carbon dioxide gas could dissolve in ocean water, and that CO2 gas, just like CO2 can jump out of solution when I open up a can of soda. There's an equilibrium there. That CO2 molecule just went into solution and then came out of solution. But those quantities, those fluxes, are kind of the same. What else have we got going on here? This is that arrow that's showing me from like sedimentary or igneous rock. That's that very first slide of the carbon cycle. This is a tiny little trickle. We don't really care about this amount. That's the CO2 that goes to the atmosphere from that geologic, like venting from a volcano. And it's this tiny, tiny, tiny amount that is not increasing the overall amount of CO2 in the atmosphere. What else have we got here? What's this arrow C? That's going from, yes. Carbon can run off from the soil into the upper ocean. I did want to point out that although we have respiration from vegetation returning carbon to the atmosphere, look at this huge amount of carbon stored in soil. That's all those soil microbes that are doing all that decomposing and all of that turnover of carbon from biotic, abiotic, and back and forth. Those soil microbes are living things that need energy and do soil respiration. So that's why part of that arrow B is going back there. The only other thing I have here then is letter H, from fossil fuels to the atmosphere. What I want you to understand is that, again, we don't care about this arrow. Of the arrows that are going to the atmosphere, the fossil fuel arrow has nothing that balances it that takes that CO2 back out to the atmosphere. Remember that plant and animal decomposition have led to a lot of storage over hundreds of millions of years. This is carbon stored in fossil fuels. The burning of that, the combustion or oxidation of this geologic stored carbon is rapidly moving carbon dioxide into the atmosphere at an unnatural rate. In fact, one of the latest reports from the International Panel on Climate Change, International Governmental Panel on Climate Change, is showing us that we are adding 38 gigatons of carbon to the atmosphere through the combustion of fossil fuels. Let's do a quick check on the carbon cycle. Which of the following major storage reservoirs of carbon stored in the form of carbon dioxide is not represented on the graph? And I'll give you just a second to look at that one. And the obvious one that we don't see here is the ocean. And we just kind of reviewed that. CO2 gas can go into solution and come out of solution. And it's important that when we're talking about carbon being in the atmosphere, if we mean carbon dioxide, we have to say carbon dioxide and not just carbon. If it's atmospheric carbon, call it carbon dioxide. So we have one more cycle to look at, and that's the hydrologic cycle. And we're going to focus on the processes and interactions here. So the hydrologic cycle is powered by the sun, and it shows me the movement of water in various solid, liquid, and gaseous phases from sources to sinks. So I have water evaporating from the surface of the ocean, or transpiration, evapotranspiration from plants. That water, that evaporated water rises, it cools off, and it condenses and falls as precipitation. It can percolate or infiltrate through the soil and recharge groundwater. It can run off into surface water and eventually into the ocean. So let's take a look at the hydrologic cycle kind of in action. I've got this cool little animation. We're going back to Africa. I think we've been there a couple of times to illustrate, to let you see kind of more in action these processes in the water cycle, the hydrologic cycle, and then we're going to make a couple of connections.
Gorongosa's water cycle starts with the evaporation of water from the Indian Ocean. The moisture-laden air moves westerly on the trade winds across Mozambique before reaching Mount Gorongosa. The elevation of the mountain forces the air to rise, thus cooling it. This then leads to condensation, which results in rainfall. In addition to supporting a lush montane rainforest, the water runs off the mountain to feed the rivers that supply Lake Urema. During the wet season from November to mid-March, there is enough moisture in the air so that clouds form and rain falls throughout the park. The lake overflows and may cover as much as 200 square kilometers, transforming a dry, grassy plain into an enormous watery haven. But much more rain falls on Mount Gorongosa, which also acts as a reservoir by soaking up some of the rain into its soil and releasing it slowly throughout the year. As the rainy season passes and fewer clouds move over the park, the floodplain retreats. Many of the rivers start to dry up. That's when the water captured and released from Mount Gorongosa becomes critical. During the dry season, as much as half of the water flow into the park is provided by the mountain.
What a cool visual for us to see kind of in action how the water cycle works. I bet some of those animals migrate for water supply too. Remember, they could migrate for food or water. Whoops. So let's see the connection that we want to make here. Climate change is really disrupting the hydrologic cycle. It's intensifying it. Because if you think of it, if I increase my air temperature, I increase the rate of evaporation, and warm water can hold more water vapor. So it leads to really intense rainfall and intense downpours. We're seeing this, I know, a lot in central Wisconsin, really a disruption to our rain patterns. And even citizens are collecting data to supply scientists by keeping rain gauges in their backyard. It's not necessarily the total amount of rain, it's that rain is coming down in really hard, intense rainstorms. Warmer water intensifies hurricanes and severe tropical storms. Warmer climates melt land ice, causing sea levels to rise. So humans have many ways that we are impacting the hydrologic cycle. So we're going to go through a guided practice question that gives you a little bit of a chance to practice some of the content and skills that we've been looking at. Remember these command terms that you're going to see on the exam. And we're going to start off. You can jot your answers down, think about them verbally. I'm going to kind of walk you through this, and then I'll leave you with your homework question to go over with Dr. Sowell tomorrow. The atmosphere is one important carbon reservoir. Describe a biological process by which carbon is removed from the atmosphere and converted into organic molecules. Notice my command term is describing a process. It doesn't ask me to name it. It doesn't say identify the name of this process. It asks me to describe it. I also want to describe a biological process in which carbon is converted from an organic molecule and returned to the atmosphere as a gas. And then oceans and terrestrial systems also are important carbon reservoirs. Explain how atmospheric carbon is incorporated into 2 oceanic sinks, and identify one terrestrial sink other than fossil fuels that stores carbon for thousands to millions of years. I'm going to give you a minute to think about that one, and then we'll check the answers. How are we doing? Let's check. Okay. Describe a biological process. And I kind of prompted you there. Notice that no point is given simply for saying photosynthesis without a description. I can say photosynthesis is the process in which, and then there's a number of ways I could have said that. Plants or autotrophs take in, notice they were really explicit here about carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and converted into, whoa, there's a lot of different ways I could say that, converted into food or glucose or sugar or carbohydrates, starches. I could also have said that plants or autotrophs fix carbon. I didn't need to necessarily specify carbon dioxide here because I'm not talking about pulling it out of the atmosphere per se. I'm fixing it or converting it into one of those foods or sugars or carbohydrates. Same thing for the next 1 point description. I don't earn a point simply for saying the word cellular respiration. And notice again that the answer must identify the form of carbon being released as part of the description. So I could say in cellular respiration, that's fine. I don't even need to say it. I'm guessing most of you did, but the real key here is describing the process. Organisms, plants and animals break down food and release carbon dioxide back to the atmosphere. We can have some methane emitted from animals. A lot of cows, for example, will belch or fart methane, depending especially on the diet that they eat, because of the breaking down of the cellulosic material, or the decomposition of organic matter by bacteria. We looked at that in the soil, converts organic carbon into gases such as methane. The next part was to explain how atmospheric carbon is stored in 2 ocean sinks. I hope, and I'm guessing a lot of you talked about the fact that atmospheric CO2 can dissolve directly into ocean water. Um, Plants, aquatic phytoplankton can remove carbon dioxide and take it up through photosynthesis, just like land plants can. Remember, I didn't even need to get specific about the carbonate and bicarbonate. I simply needed to know that that carbon was used for marine organisms to build their shells. Then we have a couple other possible answers that you may have looked at. And finally, one terrestrial sink other than fossil fuels that stores carbon for thousands to millions of years. And this is kind of a tricky one. If you simply said forests store carbon, it would not have earned you a point, because I got to tell you, we have a school of forest and we harvest trees about every 40 years. Obviously, while they're alive, they're storing carbon, but they're not considered a long-term carbon sink. So it would have to be an old growth forest. And many of those forests will store carbon for that long a period of time. Some of you may have gone to that sedimentary rock or limestone incorporated into soil. We saw that was a really big sink when we looked at that diagram. So that should have been a pretty easy 1 point to come up with. And let's take a minute to look back and kind of summarize what we did today and see if we met our objectives. So this was kind of that big takeaway from the phosphorus cycle. Go back and get the big conceptual idea of the geologic processes involved in the phosphorus cycle. But our big takeaway is that there's no atmospheric component, and the limitations this imposes makes phosphorus a limiting factor in many ecosystems. Most of the reservoirs of the nitrogen cycle hold those nitrogen compounds, for a relatively short period of time. There are many ways that humans are disrupting the carbon cycle. And I would really encourage you to go back and look at the lecture in Unit 9 on global climate change, if you have it, so you can make that bridge and connection. And then we kind of demonstrated that we could demonstrate our understanding of this. We did a lot of looking at visual representations and practicing that explain how atoms are moved from sources to sinks, and looked at and made predictions about changes in a cycle based on human impacts. So I'm going to leave you with an AP exam practice question that you'll go over the answers tomorrow with Dr. Sowell. You are going to be looking at biomes tomorrow, so this will be kind of a nice transition. Let's read through the question and the prompts together. The carbon cycle describes the movement of carbon atoms between sources and sinks. Scientists are concerned about increasing concentrations of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere because of the impacts of global climate change. Make sure I can read this. Soil microbes that decompose soil organic matter play a critical role in carbon cycling and storage by returning carbon dioxide to the atmosphere through the process of cellular respiration. Looked at that in the soil. Scientists are interested in researching how increasing soil temperatures will affect the rate at which soil microbes decompose organic matter. They design a laboratory experiment in which they measure the change in the amount of CO2 in soils incubated at different temperatures for a period of 5 days. All the soils were collected from the same location. It looks like this is a lot, but they go pretty quickly. Explain how carbon enters the soil. We just practiced that with different sinks and how that moves around. Explain how carbon in the soil is returned to the atmosphere. And then here's our 3 practice prompts on experimental design. Identify the independent variable, identify the experimental control, and describe how the amount of CO2 would change if temperatures got so high that they actually killed the soil microbes. So just a quick, make sure you write that out. You're going to check it with Dr. Sowell tomorrow. Thanks for watching. It's been fabulous. I know that these are challenging times to preparing for AP exams is always stressful. We've got some kind of dark times, but Dr. Sowell and I are really committed to making sure we do a good job reviewing and giving you lots of practice. So hang in there. You guys are doing a great job. Have fun with biomes tomorrow, and I'll see you next Monday.